So I'm Tom. I'm here at the IT University of Copenhagen, where along with Lawrence Boer, we kind of are teaching in the master's program called Digital Design and Interactive Technologies. And this is a work that came out of our kind of maybe meta thinking around what it means to be teaching interaction design at this moment. And part of what I think is motivating this is that this is a relatively new program. This comes from a reimagining of what the master's program here could be. And instead of being digital design and communication, it's been shifted towards doing interactive technology, sort of the first high level component of what we're teaching. And so part of that means that the student base comes from a broad range of different backgrounds, different kinds of skills and skill sets. And we are kind of facing a struggle with knowing what it is our master's program should be producing, what kinds of skills, what kinds of outcomes, what kinds of strengths our students should have as they exit our program and enter the workforce. And for us, we've been sort of thinking about maybe creative confidence as the main result of what a master's program in design should lead to. So students should have an experience with design projects. They should feel confident in being able to execute a design process, and they should know kind of when and why design is appropriate, what context design might not be the right answer. And when we were trying to take this idea seriously, we found this table of creative self-beliefs from Karasky et al. So here we have this idea of creative confidence on the left, the self-belief in your own ability to be creative in various kinds of application domains. But then moreover, this has a certain sense of kind of self-efficacy. So how can you perform a particular task in a particular context, or whether you're able to kind of understand yourself as a creative person across different sorts of application domains. But also we're kind of intrigued by this idea of creative self-awareness. So how do you understand your own creative strengths and your limitations and beliefs about your own creative abilities? And again, this metacognitive understanding. So when do you know when to be creative, in what context, why, and how? And overall, this idea of the creative mindset that gives you sort of this framing of what and how creativity operates in practice. So when we were trying to think about how to relate this idea of creative confidence design education, it was sort of no surprise that we'd been beaten to the punch. And the way that sort of has been happening is through this idea of design thinking. So Creative Confidence is a book, of course, that was published by Kelly and Kelly. But in general, this idea of design thinking kind of also coming from IDEO, where Kelly and Kelly are principals. This idea of design thinking has sort of become an infrastructure for how people develop awareness of what it is design does, how design operates, and how you can kind of develop a broader sense of your own capacities as a creative individual. So of course, as we're all aware, design thinking is a sort of this 5-step process where you empathize with some sort of user, you define a problem that they're having, you ideate a solution to the problem, you prototype that solution, and then you test it to see if it works. But part of the problem that we found with design thinking is that this isn't actually producing creative confidence in this kind of broad spectrum, reflexive way, but rather just kind of a sense of a sense of your own confidence in the particular methods of design thinking. So rather than understanding your own capacity as a designer, you're understanding your kind of capacity as someone to execute this methodological checklist. So Kolko has a really excellent critique of design thinking where it sort of talks about how these rich methods, including ends plus pure design or bounded rationality from Simon or Osborne's brainstorming or De Bono's vertical and lateral thinking or Schoen's reflective practice, all kind of become flattened into shadows themselves. They're sort of means of rationalizing a quick and dirty project that sort of steps through this set of categories that leads to some sort of innovative outcome. So perhaps there is a kind of creative confidence that this design thinking mode can enable, but we sort of think it's bounded to maybe these first 2 categories, where maybe you can have some sort of confidence in your ability to produce an innovative creative outcome, and you can perhaps understand a specific story that you've produced. And so this particular innovative service that you produce might be coming from this one particular context, this one particular problem. So to kind of broaden the frame for what it is that design could be and how we might produce what we would consider a richer form of creative confidence, we think that speculative and creative design really opens that door. So speculative and creative design is open to various tools, methods, and techniques from all over the place. It invites designers to really become an active participant of their own agendas, really produce their own work that has their own spirits and method involved, and take on the responsibility to produce worlds that say what they think it should. And so in this kind of broad scope, this sort of broad frame, what it is a design is and does, a speculative and critical design, like interaction design, is kind of a glue discipline as well. So it builds on many different fields, it builds on many different kinds of practices to develop a kind of agenda-laden approach that deals with emerging and future problems. So this is how we think that perhaps there's a way that speculative and critical design as part of a curriculum can lead to this sort of bigger sense of what it is creativity and creative confidence can be for designers in our program. And to kind of reflect on how this has worked for us, there's been a couple of courses that we've operated at ITU. So the first that was taught by Lawrence is experimental design and practice. This was 120 students in 30 groups in a sort of a lecture-based kind of classic HCI, to talk about the earlier examples, classic HCI mode of producing design concepts. And here this was a kind of futures speculative and critical design oriented course that was producing a futures video, maybe interactive props and a report developed around futures concepts around health, agriculture, education, leisure, economy, mobility, safety, and domesticity. And so as an example of the kind of things that it produces, there's this, on the left, you see a stills from a video called Smart Crops, where a farmer is searching for love in a kind of a format of a Danish TV dating show, hoping that he can sort of find his partner who knows that sort of he has time for her because of the ability of speculative technologies to give him time away from the field, but still the field should always come first. And on the right, we see happily ever after with data donation, where a widower fills out a form to try to put his wife's personality into a talking picture frame, where he can interact with her after her death, but it's still kind of interrupted by advertisements that occurred over the course of his interaction. And so these are examples of just the kinds of things that came out of this course, where speculation towards these kind of future issues reflected how students were imagining these problems. And in thinking about kind of whether this course kind of worked to broaden the frame of what design can do, it seemed that it worked all right, that students sort of understood what it means to sort of author futures that were speculative and critical. However, as group work, it was not clear sort of how individuals were being more or less confident or more or less creative. What did happen is that students sort of overcame some of their initial skepticism towards design that it's not real. And of course, there was creative behavior that supported this idea of creative self-efficacy and self-concept, but it wasn't, of course, clear to students why this course is mandatory. So why should they be forced to take it if what they're after is to become a web developer, for example? The second course is one that I've taught called Situating Interactions. So it has 40 students in 10 groups of 4. And this is much more of a studio-oriented course. So here this is much more of a research through design course that's built in prototyping technologies that sort of implicitly speculative and critical design. So it's not about being speculative or critical as such, but it is in fact kind of building future technologies that are always already implicitly speculative. So here are some projects that's come out of that course. Here's the fruit bowl with a pulse at the top, where fruit placed on a kind of a stake in the middle of this bowl makes this pump give a heartbeat to the bowl, sort of developed with blind users as a sort of material speculation. We have Miyagi in the center, which is this herb that you develop a relationship with by having a horoscope and prints out its daily status through this sort of receipt generator. And this was based on cultural probes. And finally, this Bodega Conservation Society was produced in sort of response to the fading Copenhagen-based pub scene of the bodega, the brown bodega, which kind of in the future might not be possible as shifting land values in Copenhagen drives out the sort of already existing forms of bars. And so these projects in this course sort of as a critique and studio-oriented specialization led to sort of more confident design reflections from students. Students gained confidence in designing through their behavior and their projects, but also kind of as taking on these broader projects, built an identity as a creative practitioner. So having a point of view and being able to make that point of view clear through their design. And this is something that we think of as leading to those sort of more metacognitive understandings of what it is a design could or should be doing, when design matters, why design is important, and how design can work to sort of tell the story of what might be better. And this is where, kind of in contrast to this design thinking mindset noted earlier, we're maybe proposing an idea of a SCD mindset. So for students, an SCD mindset lets them experiment with problems from multiple different perspectives, making the problems their own. It kind of means that they can ignore many of the traditional constraints of design, things like production, things like the real world, and engage the problem sort of on their own terms. Because design is sort of not meant to be built, they can conceptualize and engage with it sort of earnestly. They can experiment with it in their own way until it becomes exciting and motivating for them. And finally, in this sort of similar theme, it's not bounded by the real world, but it's instead about issues and context representations that can kind of bring in themselves to the frame more concretely, despite their various kinds of abilities and technical skills. So we think that there's sort of a set of 4 promising directions for speculative and critical design for creative confidence. So the first is that there's sort of this orientation to design beyond user-centeredness. So design is a form of inquiry that lets them engage the problem in a very deep way, kind of imagining new worlds that the problem can be magnified through or made important inside of. And it develops a kind of flexibility to tell a story about their design concept, giving form to these ideas as part of the structured, reflective process of design. Speculative and critical design is also really flexible. So students who are highly technical can produce highly technical artifacts. They can make things they believe matter and develop sort of reasons that technologies couldn't do these things. But also for students who are less technical, there are other modes of engaging with problems. So I've had students build doll houses that become sites that VR through cardboard can be used rather than kind of having to build real worlds. They can instead build sort of play worlds that represent the issues in their own to their own skills and abilities. Speculative and critical design is appealing because it lets them think outside the box. These lack of constraints let students work freely and kind of lets them work playfully with the future. And finally, it's authorial. So by investing in the work that lets them own it, it lets them think through what it is that they believe is important and projects what's desirable to them. And in doing that, I think it also produces a role of an increased awareness of what the role of design the designer is and how creative design can meaningfully help build confidence in the form and the act of design. But there's also a set of pitfalls with this sort of approach that I think we can probably all recognize. So perhaps the kind of most obvious one is that students don't really always see value in speculative and critical design. So especially for students who are really interested in going right into the workforce and wanting their master's experience to be directly applied to the field, speculative and critical design doesn't seem like a real design method, even though the methods and the approaches and the techniques and the process and the production are all sort of the same as user-centered design. Without a user, they feel that it's somehow made up or it's somehow not important to them in the same kind of mode. The other sort of pitfall is that the open-endedness of a critical design project or speculative design project is taken as a shortcut. So if you don't take your work seriously, or if you don't really want to engage with these as a method, the sort of jokey and playful nature becomes a way around having to do real design or real kind of thoughtful, earnest design work. It becomes a shortcut to the end rather than kind of a way to engage with the problem. Despite the sort of flexible level of different skills and ways you can get different skills into the frame, you still probably need certain kinds of form giving to build a compelling narrative around. So either video production or electronics manufacturing or physical prototyping. To make your kind of narrative land, you still require a certain amount of actual real ability to produce high quality work. And this is the same problem that I think, this last is sort of the same problem that I have with a lot of other design education, is that by having it being based in sort of these models, we're having it kind of learned by doing, you're still getting a confidence in method after the fact. So, like design thinking, like just doing design, speculative and critical design is something that you become accustomed to or confident in after you've already done it. So students who are in the middle of a project are often finding themselves absolutely lost, but I tell them that they need to actually get through in order to find out where they've been. So there isn't an easy way to get them to learn these methods, before you have to do it, but in fact, you have to do it afterwards. Only afterwards you understand what you've done. So for creative confidence, we think that speculative and critical design is sort of the right way to think about it. And in a sense, it's building the right kind of creative confidence. It's sort of metacognitive, this awareness of your own abilities, this awareness of what design is and could and should be, by using these sort of ideas of building new worlds and scenarios, by taking on the responsibility of real problems in the world, and by thinking about what it is that design could build, should build, and might be important for in the near to medium futures. Thank you.
I've got a comment about exactly what you were sort of mentioning there about one of the advantages, I think, of models like design thinking is that it gives you a starting point. It's a pattern. And particularly with teaching, it's quite easy to hand over one pattern like this and then you maybe open out later. But what's your tactic then for offering something like speculative and critical design in this kind of teaching context at the start, on day one, when you're kind of saying, oh, you can do everything. There's so much, there's so many methods, so many tools. How do you cope with that first session?
So I should say that I guess the secret here is that I don't teach the first class. So I come in maybe the second semester, doing much more prototyping oriented courses where a course called Advanced Design Process is taught in the first fall that demonstrates a lot of different methods and frames. So students are exposed to design thinking, they're exposed to the double diamond, they're exposed to these things. The way that this kind of paper has come out of conversations where these models are taken as being in some way true or in some way always the right way of doing design. And in fact, I think there's a real problem where students confuse the model for the practice, and having a way of approaching the practice kind of materially earlier might make it so that the model becomes a way to understand their own practice rather than kind of a template for how the practice needs to be done. So yeah, but of course they have that already when I start talking to them.